Good afternoon. I'm Carl Garth, and welcome to our latest edition of the Champion Chat with Councillor Alison Champion. Good afternoon, Alison. How are you today?
Hi, Carl. As always, happy to be here. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. Joining Alison for this week's chat, we have Councillor Tom Melican and Councillor Peter Castaldo. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you both today?
Very good. Thank you, Carl.
Excellent. Great. So this week, we're actually following on from the previous month's podcast, which was on sustainability and electric and the future in energy, etc. This week, this month, we're actually moving that forward now to waste recovery recycling. Peter, I understand this is definitely an area that you have a great passion in.
Yeah. It has become a serious passion, and people look at me strangely when I tell them about that.
And why do they look at you strangely for this, Peter? I mean, seriously.
I get very excited about talking about cloth nappies and other things like that. But not many people like nappies, but I don't like them, but I love them at the same time. So it's a very strange world.
Fair enough. I think people look at you strange because they've never had to use nappy Sam in their life. Okay. Well, look, let's dive right in because with that in mind, Peter, I'm hoping, Peter, Tom, Alison, I'm hoping that you'll be able to give us a little bit of a high-level snapshot around waste and recycling currently works across Banyule and what actually happens with our waste and recyclables today. Are we actually doing with them what we think we're doing them? Are we recycling everything? Are we efficient? Are we reusing? So who would like to take the lead on this one?
I could, if you like.
Fire away.
We're not bad, but we could be a lot better. We're quite lucky. Our waste goes to Alert, which is plenty of capacity, and we have an arrangement with Buller for our green waste. But we should be going to the FOGO, as it's called, food organics, garden organics, into the same bin, and the weekly green bin pickup. And also, the other thing we need to do is change our waste lids from the dark green to the red. But once we do those things, then we should really be able to pick up our diversion rates. And that's something we'll be doing it. Well, we've started the trial now, but it'll probably come in early next year, between March and probably June next year across the whole city.
Great point you just raised there, Tom. I want to just push on that a little bit more. And you said it was around our food waste, etc., going into the same green waste bin. I mean, for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, people have been putting all of their scrap food into their normal general waste. Please give us a bit of an overview of why that's bad.
Because it's a good resource, and 40% what goes into the current dark green bins or the landfill bins, 40% of that is food scraps, which then goes to landfill, fills up your landfills quicker. But as it rots, it creates methane, which is 21 times worse than CO2 at greenhouse gases. But furthermore, the big problem is we'll be paying landfill levy to dump a resource into landfill, which then creates more greenhouse gases, as opposed to getting food scraps, getting all your veg, and recycling it into compost so we can grow more food.
Okay, and this is the FOGO.
This is the FOGO.
Right, so could you just give us a little bit more explanation on FOGO?
So basically, and there are a few contentious points. What you'll do is the green bin will be larger, but your green bin will be picked up weekly, not fortnightly. Your rubbish bin will be picked up fortnightly, and your yellow recycling bin will be picked up fortnightly. Now, we'll put in some special arrangements, and I've already spoken to one resident who had special requirements. So there will be special arrangements for people who can't, and that's why Peter's excited about the nappy issue, because one of the big problems is nappies. If you're only getting your waste bin picked up once a fortnight and you're using disposable nappies, it can get quite smelly. And that's one of the issues we're going to have to address. But what it basically means is you'll be sending less to landfill and you'll be making better use of a good resource. And if you think about it, 40% of what's in your rubbish bin now is food scraps, vegetable peelings, and you take that out, then do you really need your rubbish bin to be picked up every week?
No, that's a fair comment. Just to sort of go on with what you were talking about, nappies and the smell and that. What about what are we going to do with our picking up of our pets' droppings?
Well, that's in the same boat, but you can put that in a plastic bag, and that fixes that problem.
Okay. All right. Well, look, I'm glad you actually went through that a little bit, because the first question that I really have for all of you, I'd really like to get each of you to provide your views and opinions, because again, the podcast, it is about your views, is what do each of you feel is the current biggest failing we have with waste and recycling?
I'm happy to start. I've got a couple of points that come up for me. First of all, I think we already create a lot of stuff. We create stuff. We're allowed to create, make, produce, manufacture stuff. We're allowed to. The fact that I think very recently the federal government signed another trade agreement, an updated trade agreement with I think 13 other countries in the world to continue trading globally. So that allows for us to create more stuff and send it across to other countries whenever they're ordered. The other thing too is that we create products that have a shorter shelf life, from larger items like cars through to small items like some of our tech things, our phones. We're encouraged to change them every 2 years. Well, when I grew up, you had one of these really big, fat, chunky phones that sat in the hallway. The only thing it ever did was receive a call and take a call, and it still exists because it can. It's something that's still, 50 years later, it's still available. It's still possible to use it in a landline. So there's that. There are those couple of things. But also we have, and there's a very good reason for this, so I do understand this. If you look at our health and food safety laws, you look at the medical industry and the food industry, and I've invested 23 years of my life in the hospitality industry, so I've seen it. We have laws in place that put our health first. So if we're putting our health first, it means that any utensils we use are single use, like swabs, for example, or Band-Aids. Or with our food safety, we need to wear disposable gloves preparing food. They're a single use. There's some examples there. Now, I know now we are not going to be changing our food laws and our health laws. They're not changing because they keep us as healthy as possible and minimize the germ transfer. So for me, there are a couple of things that impact negatively on waste and recycling.
Okay. Peter?
Yeah, look, Alison touched on a few things. Built-in obsolescence of products like the iPhone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, I think 14 now.
Yep.
And that's just been in, 20 years or something. So the whole economy is built on continued sales, ever increasing sales. And so there's always the plan to sell the next one rather than build something. The telephone that lasts 50 years, that is a genius idea for the world of sustainability. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And we've really got to think about that and the way the economy runs. But the dreadful thing is that no one pays for the disposal generally.
Mm-hmm.
One person that makes massive amounts of waste buys the new thing continuously. They chuck it in their garbage bin.
Mm.
The other person that makes all the effort in the world doesn't make any of that waste. They just don't chuck it in the garbage bin. They both pay the same amount to have all their disposal. So until we start pushing back the cost of removal of waste on people, you don't have an incentive to think about it, to consider it, and make decisions that start to inform you and make you think about maybe we shouldn't be making so much waste. But right now we make it too easy and people don't need to care, and they don't.
So again, you're looking more at a consumption model there.
Yeah, I'd like to think that we can solve that problem, yes.
Okay. Tom?
As usual, I slightly disagree with Peter because Peter's putting it back on the consumer.
Yep.
I think we should be putting it back on the manufacturer.
Mhm.
And the absolute classic is we all know Pringles. You know, the Pringle pack?
Yep.
To recycle a Pringle pack will cost you more than the whole thing will when it's full. You think about a Pringle pack, you've got a plastic lid on top, which goes into the plastic recycling bin. Then you have an aluminium foil, which goes into the metal bin. Then you have an aluminium rim around the top of the cylinder, which must be separated from the cardboard. And then you have a lid on the bottom, which is also metal, which must be separated from the cardboard. So you think about the resources in a Pringle pack to actually pull it apart costs more than the materials you'll gain out of it. So we can't put it on the consumer to pay for that, to do all that. Why aren't we saying to the packaging industry, and we should be, whatever you package, you have to pay, has to be included in the cost, that it'll take $2 to recycle your packaging material. Therefore, you have to pay a $2 fee whenever you put one of these things out. So if you said to the Pringle manufacturers, it takes 50 cents to unpack your Pringle box, whenever you put out a Pringle box, we want to charge you 50 cents for the recycling of that.
But you know what they're going to do with that 50 cents, Tom?
No, because that instantly, I don't care what they do with the 50 cents, instantly they'll stop putting Pringles out in those stupid tubes.
Otherwise, they'll pass it on to the consumer. And
Yeah.
the consumer who loves Pringles and doesn't want Smith's chips will now be slugged 50 cents.
Isn't that a better option? So you pay for what you get. Why as a community are we paying to recycle your packaging? And the other classic is, if you buy a television in Australia, it comes from the same factory in China that most of the televisions in the world come from. They come to Australia, they're packed in polystyrene. Same people that make that same television, when they send those televisions, European Union has a rule that you can't use polystyrene for packaging, because polystyrene is incredibly difficult to get rid of and takes enormous space up in landfills. The reason when they pack it in polystyrene, it's lighter, so they pay less shipping costs than if they packed it in cardboard. Packed in cardboard, you can recycle the whole thing. Packed in polystyrene, you've got to chuck the polystyrene into landfill. So the European Union said, we're banning polystyrene from packaging. You can't send, so you're not allowed to send anything into the EU that's packed in polystyrene. We haven't done that in Australia. There would be one simple change the government would make, and we'd remove all the polystyrene that's going to our landfill. And the problem with polystyrene, as you know, you'll often see it blowing down the street because it's so incredibly light. Falls out of rubbish bins all the time because basically they're overflowing with polystyrene. It sits by a car and smashes into 1,000 pieces, which ends up in the drains, end up in the bay. Polystyrene is incredibly difficult. It's easy to recycle, but it's worth so little. Can you imagine having half a ton of polystyrene is probably about 3 truckloads.
Right.
So who's going to pay for that transport for something that's worth 20 cents?
Totally agree.
And it gets back to this China sword, you know, when China introduced the China sword, which said you couldn't send any plastic back to China. And that caused the enormous issues in Victoria, and SKM and a few others fell over. And that's why we ended up with all these warehouses full of plastic. But the memo from China went to the Australian government and says, we're not going to accept any more of your plastic waste. What did the federal government do? Nothing, absolutely nothing. And when that ban came in, it was councils that took the waste of it because suddenly we had nowhere to send all this plastic that was being generated. It was never a sustainable model, but councils bore the blunt of the fact that the federal government did nothing to prevent all this plastic waste being generated in Australia.
Yep. And we end up with these fires at places like Tullamarine because after a while.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you all touched on certain things because in 2020, in February last year, the Victorian government released Recycling Victoria. where it is actually looking to follow the lead of countries like Sweden and create that circular economy where we get back to not just recycling, but looking to reuse more. And I think something that you all touched on was the consumerism that drives us at the moment. It's got to be new, it's got to be better. Even if it's actually not broken, we replace it. Or if it might have a fault, doesn't mean the fault can't be fixable, but you know what? We're just so used to replacing it. And, you know, having seen the vision and seen how it works in Sweden, we know that it's possible. The question will be, in Australia, do we have the will? And then the next part of that is, you know, has the council been engaged in this? What's its view on this? Do they feel that it will work in the Banyule area? What opportunities could potentially arise for Banyule in a circular economy?
Who wants to start? I'll start if you like.
Yeah, go on.
It's a one size fits all. So you think about it, they're going to force everyone to go to this 4-bin system. So people in Yarra have to go to a 4-bin system. So if you live in a single fronted Victorian Edwardian house in Fitzroy that has very tiny front yard and a courtyard at the back, you're going to get a green recycling bin for your garden waste. Similarly, someone in Nillumbik will get exactly the same. So why they're forcing this one size fits all when clearly people that live in Fitzroy have a completely different need to people that live in St Andrews, and yet they're going to get the same bin system. So I think we need to do a bit better at making sure that the system that's implemented by the individual councils meets the needs of those residents, not just everyone's got to have a 4-bin system. And the classic is this purple bin, which is the glass recycling bin. Councils are being pressured into putting them in now. The issue is the container deposit scheme hasn't come in as yet. So once the container deposit scheme comes in and how many items that would go in the purple bin or the glass bin won't be there. So will councils be sending trucks around to pick up empty bins or 1 or 2 bottles in them? We don't know. So and then the other problem is if you go to the country councils, the rural councils, it costs them more to ship if they do collect all that glass, it costs them more to send them to the recycling centre than the glass is worth. So we're being forced into a one size fits all when councils are so clearly different and the needs of the residents are clearly different, and yet we'll all have to go to this same system. That's the big. There are some big advantages, but that's the big drawback with, I think.
The interesting thing there that you touched on about the transport, reading the plan, they're looking at 4 hubs to cover all of Melbourne. 4 hubs for covering recycling, photo, the whole shooting match. What are the transport costs going to be to actually move all that weight?
Now this touches on the subject from last week about electric vehicles. When you supply energy through electricity to a vehicle that's efficient, it's incredibly cheap. But you create other issues that you start transporting at longer distances, maybe. And so those are some of the things about globalization. We transport things that were once generated and manufactured locally, ever increasing distances. But when we're talking about circular economy, I'll come back to that. It's very interesting. It's very important to cut between what is spin and what is actually effectively real good circular economy. Sweden, 50% is recovered, 50% goes into an incinerator. In Australia, in Banyule, 50% is recovered, 50% goes into landfill. So it's the same, just about, apparently, some figures I just checked out. Now, what's really important is Sweden are happy to they've got multiple plants to burn their waste all around the country. Now, is that a good way of recovering the maximum amount of product? I don't think so. I think it's only for very niche things that can't be recovered. And so we haven't done that hard work that a circular economy requires to do maximum recovery of materials. We haven't even started that. First is food organics.
Yep.
The second biggest waste stream is nappies.
Mhm.
And so that's why I focus with Banyule, we've hit the biggest one, food organics. We're doing it the most effective way. Then now that's why I've switched on my focus is on cloth nappies, the second most, because we've adopted it as a council to adopt a good food organic collection.
Mhm. Mhm.
So then we've got to keep going down strategically, the next most important. And once we've done everything, we can maybe do some incineration for specific things. So I'm very cautious to say that any country is doing it better than others. That each country does it different models. They put their recovered energy from that, I think, into pipes to heat homes. We don't have that sort of situation here. So there's very specific benefits to the models being used across the globe. And some countries do a lot of spin, I think.
Sure they do. Yeah, absolutely. But the one thing that some of them have done, and I think it's one of the things that we need to be looking at, and I'd love to get your views on this, is a lot of these things require changing people's individuals' habits. And they really have looked at incentivizing it in areas where they've tried to create circular economies. I didn't see that in the Vic recycling plan, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been talked about. Do any of you have any insights?
Now, a really important piece of work is the landfill levy. The landfill levy prices up the cost of garbage going to landfill. So then companies start thinking, well, we're going to junk it in the landfill. It's going to cost us $200 a ton. Or is there a company that'll separate it and then have a value to that product rather than a cost? And so it creates a market for new entrants, companies to do recovery, which is a good thing. So I think that's the most important structural method that sends market signals to enable a greater level of recovery. So, and then that landfill levy goes into a broad suite of things to do with the environment. But when it's targeted to supporting industry that can recover those materials, it's I think the most important element to start us moving in that recovery direction. Yeah.
Okay, and that's at the industrial level. What about the individual level?
As Peter said, what drives the individual level is the cost, and that's difficult to relate back to a ratepayer. But Peter's quite right. When you look at demolition and construction, about 80% of what they do is now recycled. And the classic is, years ago, if they demolished a house, they got to dump a big bulldozer and they pushed it over and they put it all in the back of the truck. Now they come along and they take parts off it, the metal, all that stuff, because they know that if they put it in the bin, they pay a cost, dump it in landfill, whereas they can recycle it. But then all the concrete is left to last, and that's all broken up, put in a separate truck, taken off somewhere, ground down, get the sand out of it, and reuse it for concrete. So that is a price signal that was sent to that industry to say, if you keep dumping concrete into landfill, we're going to charge you. It's currently $125 a tonne. It's going to go to $160 a tonne. And it's changed a whole pattern of behaviour. But that's very difficult for an individual resident to achieve that. But getting back to your transport costs, Peter talked about electric vehicles, and they will fix one problem with the fuel. But a rubbish truck's worth about $500,000. And if you have to drive them 20 k's further and 20 k's further back to get to where they're going, you're going to need to buy another truck. And then you've got on top of that all the wages of the people driving the truck. So, and that's why they're doing this down in the southeast, where they've currently got a landfill, which is the only landfill in the southeast, which is in Kingston, will close in 2025. So when that closes, the people in those councils down in the southeast will be driving their rubbish to Wyndham. Now you think about it, it's not the petrol costs. All the garbage trucks will be going over the Westgate Bridge. And you know what the Westgate Bridge is like. But then, and you'll say, well, why don't we just do it at night time? Well, if you're in Wyndham and not far from where the tip is there, do you want trucks waffling down the road through it all night, every night? So the big, it's transport is the thing we need to reduce, but it's not just the petrol cost, it's the time costs and the fact that you need more trucks. But then, as you said, there's going to be 4 hubs, but there's only going to be 3 in 2025. There will only be 3 landfills available to people in Melbourne. One at Wyndham, one at Ravenshaw, Deer Park, and the other one at Wollert. They're your choices. And can you imagine trying to build another landfill in anywhere in Metro Melbourne?
What I'm hearing from you, Tom, is we've still got a long way to go to make sure we've got the right infrastructure to actually create this type of future of a circular economy where it's actually efficient.
And not only the infrastructure, we need more players, because the problem was when SKM fell over, there's basically only 2 other players in the industry, and they dominate the industry, dictate terms. I know that there are 2, but they don't really compete head on against each other. We need more players in the industry to provide more options, and we basically need a bigger recycling or companies, and we're trying to attract more, and that's what the circular economy talks about. But what to do that, we need to drive the end markets. We need to make sure that there's a market for all this recycled material, and the circular economy talks about that as well. But can you ever think of something that the Victorian or the federal government's done, or local, to actually say, here's an incentive to recycle the stuff because here's a market we're generating? It doesn't happen enough. We need to create.
The last one I can remember was, as a child, Scout Hall, go around, pick up bottles for 5 cents and 10 cents. So that was what we did to raise money.
But that raises money, but it's still not an end market for the product. You need to create the market for the end product. And you're right, we used to do it because that was in the days when there was CUB and not much else, and all the beers came in the same bottles. You go to the bottle shop now, every beer manufacturer has a different shaped stubby and a different colour. So how do you recycle 50 different sorts of stubbies when they're different shapes, different colours, and different thicknesses? So we've made it incredibly difficult. So how do you get an end market for that sort of glass? Whereas when you're a boy, Carl, those bottles, didn't matter if they had Foster's or Vic or Melbourne, are the same bottle. They'd CUB stamped on them, and you could send them all back and they could wash them and fill them up with beer again. And it didn't matter. You can't do that anymore. So you've got to have that end market for these materials, and we simply don't do enough to develop those end markets. And even we're starting to do it now, glass and a few other materials that they're putting into roads and plastic. But until recently, Vic Roads used to specify how much recycling material you could put in your roads, and it was quite limited. So by Vic Roads rules, you couldn't put recycled concrete into your local roads. They're starting to change that, but we don't do enough to drive the end markets either.
Who should be taking the leadership of that then? Federal?
Well,
because I mean, a local government can't do, as much around that. I mean,
I definitely think it's very hard for the individual to change the system. And the more I get into it, the more I realise that we can only do tinkering around the edges. It's so important that the federal is fully on board, state has to be fully on board, and same with all those industries that are setting standards around, like the hospital and the gloves and everything else. And we've got, like Vic Roads is another example. Unless they've told you, or there's something that they're forced to do it, they're not going to do it. They just don't care about it a lot of places. So it's really problematic because they're stopping us from improving what we're hoping to achieve as a council or individuals in my mind. So I think it has to come from the top, definitely.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter. Well, it does, but there also has to be a level of initiative at all levels of government. There's got to be some level of initiative. And just coming back to you know, Tom talking about polystyrene, how it weighs less than other materials for packing. That mentality is, I remember, you know, I'm sure many of you remember Australia Post, how much does this weigh, therefore you pay X on weight. That mentality has to change. The mentality around recycling and waste disposal has to change. We actually have to remove a whole lot of processes and systems we have in place, get them off the table and start again from scratch and go and do some brainstorming and go, right, how can we do this? What do we do? What do we need? What's, you know, Tom talks about an end product or an end consumer. What's that? Is it different now? What's the end consumer now? What can we see that being in 50 years? We have to actually think way outside the box and come up with other things. And we all have to do it at the 3 government levels. And there's no finger pointing, there's no blaming, there's no, oh, you shoulda, you coulda, you done. Yeah. There's none of that. It's just, how do we move forward? What do we do differently to move forward?
And what's worked in the past is the television scheme, where every time a television was sold, there was $20 added to the cost from the manufacturer, which went to a fund, which then paid for recycling of televisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now we're doing the same with paint, because paint, as you know, everyone's, you know, you use 3/4 of the paint tin. What do you do with it? Difficult to recycle, but it's also incredibly damaging if you chuck it into the landfill levy.
Yeah.
So now there's 50 cents for every litre of paint sold that goes to recycling paint.
Mm-hmm.
So it's work, but these have got to be federal government initiatives, because as you knew, when we had the landfill levy, and New South Wales' landfill levy's always been a lot higher, but at one stage, the landfill levy in New South Wales was $150 a tonne, which is even more than it still is in Victoria. But in Queensland, it was $10 a tonne.
Mm-hmm.
So you used to have train loads of rubbish being sent from New South Wales to Queensland to be dumped in the holes in Queensland, because that was cheaper. So, and Queensland have now increased theirs to about $50 a tonne, so it's taken that incentive away. But there's all these perverse incentives for people to do strange things, whereas you have a federal guideline that says the landfill levy is this, and you can't move rubbish, or you can't ban rubbish going over state borders, because then the issue is you've got a recycling plant in Albury, people in Wodonga can't use it. Like it's incredibly complex, but then you need to get rid of some of these inequities between the states to make sure that it's a level playing field. But, you know, when was the last time we actually had federal government talk about any of these issues? Yet they have all the power and they have the resources, and yet it's not really a thing they get into. Whereas they should be more. And food's the other one that, you know, they've done a lot around the food waste industry federally, but they need to do so much more. And if you look, the television scheme worked, why not roll it out right across a whole series of products? And the other one is mattresses are the other big problem.
It's really interesting because you know, you see a lot of people get up on posts and forums and say, you know, why do local governments worry about nuclear? Why do they worry about this? Why do they worry about that? Can't they just focus on waste and roads? And of course, you've just outlined that it's not one group that has control or responsibility. It is actually all levels of government, all levels of society that need to start working together on this. And where the questions that I have for you coming out of this then are, you know, will councils need to start building partnerships with each other, considering the space required, not so much for landfill, but for the infrastructure, so that we're getting maybe away from these centralised models, which seem to carry a lot of cost, allow for monopolies, and to be honest, don't seem to drive change as quickly as if we had a more decentralised model.
Yeah, but the problem with that is the economies of scale. And if you look at this waste energy plant they want to build down in the south, to get that to a point where it's economically viable, they need 200,000 tonnes a year before it's viable. So one council can't build that sort of infrastructure. And then if you had every council trying, like you imagine in Banyule, we went to build a waste to energy plant somewhere in Banyule, the outcry from the local residents would be enormous. So there's currently 9, potentially 15 councils will come together to build this facility down in the southeast. You're looking at a $200 million facility. Like, that's the sort of cost you're looking at. And I think they will get that off the ground because they have to, because if they don't, they're driving all the waste from the southeast suburbs to Werribee, and that's just not a viable option at all. So that's what's driving that. The landfill levy going up will help a bit, but that's what I mean. It's not, the federal government can't fix this, the state government can't fix this, and councils can't fix this. Needs all three to work together.
Yeah.
Okay. So question on that, because you've just given us the view that, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars to build this infrastructure. Now, we also know that government funding can be, where it goes can always depend on what's the hot topic of the day that a government wants to focus on. Do you think that we will see more private investment into recycling and to help us realise this future? And if so, how's this going to affect the council's ability to ensure quality and compliance of waste and recovery?
It will take, well, councils aren't going to come together and build these plants. It will be the private industry. And what they need is guaranteed feedstock. So they need to know, they're not going to build this unless they know they can get the tonnes they require for at least a 20-year period. And that's the big advantage councils have, because we can come together and we can offer that. No other parties in the industry can't. We can say, us 20 councils will deliver this much feedstock to your plant for the next 20 years, and private industry will then go and build the facilities. That's where we're trying to get to.
And how do you keep a level, though, of oversight around compliance and quality of what they're doing to ensure that proper environmental practices are adhered to?
That'll be part of their plan. They'll need to put in for a planning permit when they build these facilities, and they'll be locked into their planning permit conditions.
Mm.
And the other thing I'd say, people have, I know it's going to, you'll hear a backlash whenever these things are proposed. But if you look at some of the waste to energy facilities in Europe, particularly, and there's one on the banks of the Thames, not far from the centre of town, and they're saying there the air quality going in is worse than the air quality coming out. So the filters they have, the processes they run, actually clean the air going through a waste to energy facility. So the techniques, the technology's there to actually make these, and there's other ones in Sweden, as you talk about in Sweden, they're in the middle of parks.
Mm.
Yeah, the air quality is so good.
Mm.
There is a problem, though. If we're just burning waste, like plastics and other fossil fuels that are in the waste stream, we're just creating carbon emissions rather than going into landfill, where it would be better for plastic to go into the land rather than us be burning it. And actually, you lose energy by burning plastics because of the amount of new energy needed to create the plastics from new fossil fuels. And so, look, incineration, I think, could be useful for very niche areas, but we're very far away from doing everything we can to recover the materials at this point. So anything that encourages the rollout of incineration, now I'm very hesitant to go down that path. And that's when I'm thinking big strategically, because once you say you need that feedstock, well, you get fined if you don't provide the feedstock. And that means let's not worry about recovering more material, because we're going to get fined if we don't give them it. So
that is a good point. But then it all gets down to, we do need the plastic. I know everyone boohoo's single-use plastic, and that's correct. But then are you better off having a plastic bag that keeps your bananas and your oranges fresh for another few days, or you're just better off chucking them out? You think about the energy and the water that it takes to produce these goods. If a single plastic bag preserves them for an extra 3 or 4 days, and therefore they get eaten, as opposed to throw away, what is the better outcome?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
no.
This sounds like a good debate for another time. I think I'll move us on a little bit. Because one of the things that we've talked about, obviously, some of the Recycling Victoria initiatives are already in train, and you did already talk about some of the plans that council has with the bins and changing the colour of the lids, etc. With the plan, though, and with the different types of bins, will residential rates be impacted?
It's a cost saving because of the landfill levy.
So the question therefore is, I asked, will it be impacted? Impacted can mean up or down.
At this point in time, we incorporate it into the rates. And so if our cost of waste services drop, well, that means that instead of spending money on waste management, we can spend it on other resources. And that's what we will tend to do, is that we can actually deliver better services elsewhere. But if we separate the waste costs to a waste charge, then it will just immediately go back to the resident. If we're reducing our waste, the cost saving goes directly back to the resident straight away. And if we have increased costs, well, then the resident will pay increased costs. So I'm big for separation of the waste charge, because that then gives a price signal to residents, and that means rates down if waste costs go down. And I think it's the best way for us to move forward. We're one of very, very few not to have done it by now.
Just because we're one of a few not to have done it doesn't mean it's right, Peter. And again, I will hate to disagree with you, but it's a regressive tax, Carl. So basically what Peter's saying, if we separate the waste charge out from your general waste, the person in the more affluent areas will overall pay less rates. The people in the smaller houses, less valuable houses, will pay overall more rates. So it's a very inequitable way of, because basically currently you pay your waste is a component of your rates, a percentage of your rates. If you take it out and make it a fixed amount, the ones paying more rates will pay less, and the ones paying less rates will pay more. So you've got to balance that issue up. And I've always thought that, yes, if waste charges go up and we bring in a separate waste charge, the burden is more in percentage-wise on the people that can least afford it.
There's a cost signal, and that's what we've been talking about. So we need to send cost signals to the purchasers of goods and to people in our community. Otherwise, if it doesn't cost them anything, they'll continue doing it.
So if we live in a small block of land in a very tiny house and produce very few little wastes, how can, whatever I do, I can't save any off my bin charges. I can't, all I know is every time waste charges go up across the city, no matter if I don't put anything out, I still have to pay more in proportion to someone that lives in a much bigger house.
So it sounds like this is a bit of an ongoing debate. We can go a number of different ways there. So again, we might move on from that. Question I do have is, so what's the future of the Banyule Waste Recovery Centre then?
Oh, that's locked in. That's owned by Visy, and it's one of the important.
Visy.
So you imagine if we propose building another one, a facility like that somewhere now, whereas it's an existing facility in a site that's suitable, and it's very important, as you know, not only Banyule use it, other councils use it as well, and it's a local facility that compresses it and processes it. So it's really it's you know, we'll be there for a long time because it's council owned it, but it's leased by Visy.
Yep.
If we were to close it, where would we send that material? So it'd be
part of the long-term strategic plan.
So we're actually quite lucky that it's there. Manningham have got no such facilities, so they have to ship everything they produce somewhere else. So that's a real problem for them. So we're actually quite lucky to have it, and I think we should be protecting it, looking after it, and ensure it continues.
Carl, you touched on something earlier about the 4 locations around Melbourne, the strategic waste recovery zones. Now, they were constructed for this very reason, that now that we've got new environmental standards, I think there's a buffer of 400 metres around any of these waste management type services.
Mm.
And so there's limited places close to Melbourne that enable that to occur. So they had to work on a strategic plan well into the future to lock in some of these locations to do that waste. Otherwise, we'd be driving halfway to Sydney or wherever else as our suburb reaches halfway to Sydney. But our little local one would never get a planning permit to build that now, ever. So it's got a unique planning zone allocated to it that permits it to continue doing what it does now because of the past. So it's a very unique piece of land that our council really put to good work in that space and do something we couldn't possibly try and do if we were trying to do it now from scratch. So it's unique in that. And I think given its very valuable opportunities to do waste recovery and other things locally, I'd like to see the services offered there expanded and everything that can be moved off that site so we can expand the waste recovery that goes on in that location.
Okay. So we're into our last couple of questions because we're almost out of time, but population of Melbourne on current projections by 2041 will be 7.8 million people who are going to generate 16.5 million tonnes of waste per year, 2 tonnes of waste per person on current projections and the way we currently operate. When you look at those numbers, what do you feel will be the greatest challenge we're going to face with this?
Well, that doesn't matter. If you look at the current predictions of waste being generated and the waste being recycled, they're poles apart. And so there's so many things, and circular economy tries to address it. Waste minimisation is the first thing we should be working on, because to date we've tried to focus on recycling without creating the end markets, which that's failed miserably because our end market was put it all in a container and send it to China. That's not recycling. So the first thing we need to work on is actually reducing the amount of waste we generate. That's number one, because that's the easiest and cheapest for everybody. Yep. So that's number one. And then number two is better at recycling stuff. But then once we recycle it, making sure we have an end market for that recycled material. And the classic, the one that gets me is if you go into Kmart, you can buy a toaster for $10, an electric toaster, and it'll probably last you 12 months at best. How can you possibly recycle a toaster that's worth $10? You're going to pull it apart and rebuild it and put it back on the shelf for $10. Like, it's just ridiculous. And then I shouldn't pick on fantastic furniture, but you can go and buy a whole house worth of furniture for a couple of grand. And what we find is, people come in to Melbourne, might be doing a uni course for a couple of years. They go and buy $3,000 worth of furniture, furnish their apartment out. When they leave, they put it on the front nature strip and walk away. And these couches and whatever, you can't do anything with them. There's not one thing worth recycling of it. So why do we permit people to sell things that aren't recyclable?
Actually, they're my two things as well. One of them is the habits we create for ourselves, and we each as an individual, we make choices. We make choices. We're responsible for our choices. And so that's one of the challenges. We need to be aware of what we choose when we go shopping or, obtaining materials or food or something. Where do we get it from? But also the fact that manufacturers are allowed to produce, to a degree, whatever they want, all in the name of a circular economy, or an economy that could be more circular is probably a better expression. So there are those two things. Hence, we need to think outside the box a lot more.
Peter?
Yeah, look, they project those are the amounts of waste into the future. I like to think there are some very significant ways we as individuals can reduce that. And if we do really well on food organics, we can halve almost the amounts that goes into landfill. We spoke about FOGO before, putting your food organics and green organics out. The best thing you can do is actually keep it on your block in a green cone, composting, worm farm.
Yep.
So that's the first priority. So you let less stuff leave your home, keep it on your block. I've got a mulcher, I've got a worm farm, I've got a compost bins, and then I stick it in my garden. So no green waste ever leaves my house in the last 10 years, but just about, except for gall wasp off my citrus. So the thing is, we can all make a lot of changes. Recyclables there's a tremendous amount that leaves my house, and I'm really a bit embarrassed by how much leaves recycling. And that's very hard to reduce. We need industry to work on. Food, organics and stuff, we can work on as individuals. Those recyclables, we need state and federal to work on that.
Yeah.
And that's part of that 1.6 million tonnes, I think they count recyclables. And then the other one is landfill. Well, if you take out your food and then you do your cloth nappies with children, you've got almost nothing that leaves the house unless it's a broken toy or it's legs off your chairs that have smashed up, and then you can really do a lot yourself, but we need the other places to enable us to recycle things. Maybe furniture, that's a very hard one. And like the others were saying, is we should only buy very good quality or secondhand. I think secondhand is critical. That's another area that I've seen that we can save a lot. Op shops are wonderful, wonderful places.
Yeah.
There's a lot of online groups that enable you to exchange goods.
Yep.
And 80% of my home is secondhand, and the other 20% is expensive, really lovely stuff. And so I invest everything in a few pieces, and then cheap secondhand generally does the rest for me. That are lovely produced materials and things from other people's purchases before me. So I think that's my approach, and I'd love to see much greater uptake and support of recycling of goods that you're happy to send away. When you got kids, you're constantly trying to send your goods on to someone else to take. So that is some of how I'd like to deal with it, and I think our council started on that journey, but we could do a lot more still. So
okay. Well, look, it sounds like it's going to be very interesting next decade as we get to terms with this. Energy, climate, waste, recycling, reusing. But unfortunately, that is time for us today. So I'd like to thank you for your time today, Alison, Peter, Tom, who's gone.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this podcast. And join us next time on the Champion Chat, where we will be discussing social change and local government support. Thank you very much, Alison and Peter.
Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Carl. Alison.
Thanks, Peter.